Hello and welcome back to 30 Days of AWS Terraform. My name is Piyush and this is day 21, I believe. Yes, it is day 21. And in this video, we'll be looking into AWS policy and governance, how we can automate the setup of policy and governance in AWS using Terraform. I hope you have been following the series in the same sequence from day 0 onwards, because most of the concepts I have already explained in the previous videos where we were looking into Terraform core concepts, and now we'll be practicing some real-time projects. This is another real-time projects that we are working on, and it would be really helpful if you have watched the previous videos to understand the nuance behind all the Terraform concepts. Okay, so if you have done that, then let's go and let's start with this video. In this video, first let's try to understand what exactly is policy and governance, right? So it's two part, right? Policy and governance. Policy is as simple as when we are enforcing some rules. Okay, so we are creating some policies, we are creating some rules that our organization has to follow. In this case, our AWS environment has to follow. So that's the policy. What are these kind of rules? So these kind of rules could be like, if the user does not have MFA enabled, then the user cannot delete any resource in AWS. That's one type of policy. Another type of policy could be, whenever you upload an object to an S3 bucket, it should be encrypted in transit. Encrypted in transit meaning, like, let's say there is a bucket over here. So whenever you are uploading an object to the bucket, right, it has to be done over HTTPS. That means encrypted in transit. Okay, encrypted and rest and encrypted in transit. Transit meaning when we are transferring it over a protocol such as HTTP, it should be secured HTTP, so that the data should be encrypted while in transit. Transit as in when the data is transferring from client to the server. Server here is an S3 bucket, right? So that's encryption in transit. Another example of policy could be whenever you create an object such as an S3 bucket, or let's say an EC2 instance, it should have some requirement tags. For example, environment equal to dev, or like there should be a tag with the name environment. Okay, so that's some of the policies examples that we'll be creating. So this is IAM policies, and these policies will make sure that all the resources are compliant, otherwise the creation would fail. Okay, let's say if there is a user who does not have an FN enabled and that user try to delete the object, that action will be restricted. The same way, if a user try to upload an object to the S3 bucket over HTTP without the secure HTTPS, that upload will be restricted, and so on, right? So that's IAM policies, which prevent some bad action and basically blocks the request that is not approved. Okay, so that's policy. Now there is a part governance. Governance means storing all the activities, keeping a log of all the activities so that we know what is compliant and what is not compliant. Okay, so it's basically related to compliance. It covers compliance as well as audit. Okay, so for that we'll be using an AWS service called AWS Config. Okay, AWS Config, if you have not worked before with it, AWS Config is a service which helps you create config rules. So these rules are similar to IAM policies, but these rules will be applied after the action has been performed. Okay, let's say it will allow the resources without the tags to be created, but it will log that as an uncompliant resource or incompliant resource. Okay, so we'll be creating 6 different kind of rules in this video. So when we run the config, it will make sure that, okay, my room has turned into a disco light, something wrong with my backlight. So I'm not doing that, by the way, it's just happening. So where was I? Okay, so we'll be creating 6 different rules, and these rules will monitor and check for compliance. Like, it will show you whether the resources are compliant or not compliant. Okay, and then we have an S3 bucket. We'll be creating an S3 bucket in which we'll be storing the audit logs. This bucket will be encrypted, versioned, and public access will be blocked on this bucket. This will be a private bucket where we'll be storing our audit logs. Okay, so End to end, this will be a project for audit and compliance, for policy and governance, in which will be preventing some actions using IAM, will be detecting some uncompliant resources using AWS Config, and then finally will be storing all the audit logs and everything in the S3 bucket. And this is kind of a real-time project that we'll be doing.
All right, so here is my day 21 folder. You can clone the GitHub repo or you can write it from the scratch. Actually, I would suggest you writing from the scratch, otherwise, you will not be able to understand all the things. But if you do that on your own by following through the documentation, then it will be really helpful. So that is what I would suggest. But if you're stuck somewhere, you can just definitely take the guidance from the video and from the repo as well. So there are multiple files in which I have distributed the configuration. The first file is main.tf. In main.tf, we are creating the S3 bucket in which will be storing our audit logs, our config, compliance and non-compliance related details. So we'll be creating the bucket, we'll make it encrypted, we'll block all the public access, and then we'll enable versioning. We'll also attach bucket policy to it so that AWS config service can have access to this bucket and can upload objects to this bucket. Okay. So we'll start with the resource S3 bucket. We'll create the bucket, okay, with a name. Over here, we are using a random string suffix at the end, and this is coming from this resource over here, random string. Okay, so we are creating a random string resource with the reference name as suffix. Length is 6. That means it will generate a string of 6 characters without any special characters because it is false, and without any uppercase letter because it is also false. So lowercase 6 letter string without any special character. It will append this as the suffix of this bucket name, okay, because it's at the end. And prefix will be the project name. Okay, so project name hyphen config bucket hyphen the suffix. Then it will have some tags. Okay, then we'll enable versioning on the bucket. What are we doing? We are just using the AWS S3 bucket versioning resource, and in that we are making sure that versioning is enabled. So wherever you find any doubt, you just go to Terraform provider documentation over here, right? And you can just search for the provider. For example, for AWS provider, the resource that we are using is AWS S3 bucket versioning. And let's search for the resource which is over here. Okay, over here, right, it says versioning configuration status is enabled. So that's the only field it needs other than the bucket name, obviously, because we are applying this bucket versioning on some bucket, right? So bucket name has to be there, and this is what we are doing over here. So bucket name and then the versioning. Then enable encryption on config bucket. Now for the same thing, you can just go and search for the resource. It says 3 bucket server size encryption configuration. Now you might be thinking, how do I know that this is the resource that I have to use, right? So there are two things. First is you start with, because it's related to S3 bucket, so you start searching the object with the name AWS S3 bucket. Okay, in S3 bucket you will find all these different resources, and then you select the one that you see most identical to the resource that you want to create. For example, you want to create bucket versioning, right? So AWS S3 bucket, that's the main resource, and inside that you will see, okay, what are all the different resources. So we have bucket logging, lifecycle, a bucket object, notification, object log, policy, and then we have bucket server size encryption. We have S3 bucket versioning, right? So these are the resources that we need. And as you keep on practicing, as you keep on using Terraform, you will know, like you will it's like a muscle memory that you are building for yourself. That is why I told you to write the Terraform file on your own. Okay, so the same thing we can find bucket versioning, same thing we can find server side encryption. For server side encryption, you see there are different type of encryption that you can apply. So and everything has to be inside the rule. So this is what we are doing: bucket name and then the rule. Now there is SSC algorithm which is from KMS. That means you will create a KMS key and use that to encrypt the server side objects on the bucket, right? So that's one thing. There could be other type of rules. So this is one, and then let's see what all rule definition. So here's the rule. Inside rule we have block encryption type, bucket key enabled. It says optional whether or not to use Amazon S3 bucket key for KMS. Okay, and then inside that we have apply server side encryption by default. Okay, so this is part of rule. Okay, inside rule we have apply server side encryption by default. So you can see this particular argument is part of rule, and if you click on that you will be redirected over here, and over here you have two things. One is SSC algorithm and KMS master key. KMS master key is optional and it will be only used when you want to use your KMS master keys ID for the SSC KMS encryption. Okay, and it will only be used when you have SSC algorithm set as AWS KMS. But if you don't store, if you are not using your KMS key, then you can use AES 256, and in that case you don't have to provide the master key ID. So this is what we are doing. We're just enabling this and saying SSC algorithm is AES 256. So this is the value where it is. So you're using SSC algorithm. Okay, and now from where you get the value here inside a SSC algorithm, these are the valid values: AES 256, AWS KMS, KMS DSSC, and so on, right? So we are using AES 256 over here. Now the next is we are blocking public access to the bucket. We are making the bucket private. It's a config bucket. It shouldn't be exposed publicly, right? It's one of the best practices. So in that, all the default things, so everything has to be true so that the access will be blocked, your public ACLs will be blocked, public policy will be blocked, and access should be restricted. Then we'll be creating an S3 bucket policy for the config. Okay, in that we'll be attaching multiple policy documents. Okay, what are these? First is config bucket permission check. So service config, AWS config will check whether it has the permission to upload objects on the bucket or not, to get the bucket ACL or not, and basically this is what it is, right? And to list the bucket or not, and finally to put the object on the bucket or not. Okay, now there is this thing string equals S3 AMC ACL. I would highly recommend reading it out on the documentation and you will get the better idea about it, right? So it will provide a bucket owner full control to the config service. Now it will also have a permission to deny the traffic if it is insecure. That means if it is over HTTP and not HTTPS. There is this condition as well which says bool AWS secure transport equal to false. Okay, now if you're wondering how to generate this policy documentation, you can just go to AWS policy generator. Okay, this is over here, and then you can select type of policy as S3 bucket policy. You can select the statements allowed. You can add the principal, which is I believe it was config, and then you can select the action like put object, right? As three put object, you can select the resource ARN, and finally you can add the conditions over here. So there is a condition which is of type boolean. Okay, it says if AWS secure transport is false, and then it will return the value, the boolean value, true or false. The same way there is this condition which is string equals, that means it will compare this string with this. Okay, key and value comparison it will do. And yeah, so that was the bucket policy. And then we are creating just a dependency on the bucket public access block. Okay, so this will be applied once the previous resources have been completed. Then we have IAM. Inside IAM, we are creating multiple policies, and these policies will restrict certain actions on AWS resources for users, right? So the first one is MFA delete policy. Okay, resource type should be AWS IAM policy. And if you can just check it over here in the documentation, AWS IAM policy over here, what it is saying, it is saying you add the name, path, description, and finally the policy documentation which is in the form of JSON. So this will be a valid JSON syntax generated from the policy generator. Okay. Or like if you practice it enough, you might not be able to use the policy generator. You can directly write it down by yourself, but it's good to use the policy generator. Okay. So what it has, it says SID, which is a unique ID. You can write whatever you want over here. Then effect is deny, and what is action? S3 delete object on any resource. So any S3 bucket, if we are trying to delete that, it will check the condition if the multi-factor authentication is false or not. Okay, so access will be denied if the multi-factor authentication is false for that user. So that's the first policy. Second policy is to enforce encryption in transit. That means whenever we are uploading an object to the S3 bucket over HTTP, it will be blocked. Okay. So same thing, the action should be put object, and over here the condition will be secure transport equal to false. Okay. The next policy is required tagging of resource creation. That means whenever we are creating a resource in AWS or in this environment where we are applying this config, that resource should have a particular tag. What tag it is? So the effect is deny, action is on EC2, so only on EC2 we are applying this policy, and on, like, you have to provide the ARN, which is this one. Now condition is it will be blocked if string not like this. So request tag or environment is not equal to dev, staging, or prod. If we are selecting the tag with request tag or environment is not equal to any of these, then the request will be blocked. And required owner tag also. So there are multiple tags. The other tag is owner tag. Owner tag should be true. Okay, that's another condition. Now the next is we are creating an IAM user for demonstration. Okay, just to demonstrate. Okay, now we are attaching an MFA delete policy to the demo user, the one that we have created. Basically the policy ARN and the user. Okay, so this is the policy that we have created, and this is the user, and then we have AWS IAM policy MFA delete policy. We're attaching that policy to the user. Then we have IAM role for AWS config service. Okay, so we applied an S3 bucket policy on the bucket for the config, but then we have to apply certain permissions on the config service as well. So, right, so for that we'll be creating a role. So this role will have the permission to assume role from the config because it has already been applied to the bucket, right, at the config. So we just have to assume the role over here. Now we have to attach that managed policy to the config role, which is like this: role, policy, ARN, and so on. And we'll be providing additional policy for config to write to the S3 bucket, right? So it will have the allow and get bucket versioning, put object, get object, these type of permissions on the S3 bucket. So this is the bucket, the audit bucket, in which we'll be uploading all the audit logs, config related and compliance and non-compliance related things, right? So this was the IAM file. Now the next one is config. In config, we are creating basically the config recorder, in which we'll be basically creating the config rules and so on, right? Config creator, config rules. So first is the config recorder. It says recording group all supported true, include global resource type is true. Okay, and then a config delivery channel. Delivery channel is the S3 bucket name. We'll be providing that over here, and then we'll be starting the config recorder. We are just enabling it, and then we are saying it is depending on the delivery channel, which is this one. Okay, so once the bucket is there, you can start the config recorder. Now it is important to learn about AWS config before this video, and that is why in the day zero video I have told you that the prerequisite of this series is you should have the fundamental knowledge of AWS services, and that would be helpful, right? So yeah, this is the config part, and now we'll be creating config rules for the compliance check. Okay, so remember in the beginning of the video, I told you that there's a difference between IAM policy and config rule. IAM policy restrict the creation of resources or restrict any actions on the resources when the policy is applied, but the config rule will check the compliance if the resource is compliant or not, right? So this will not prevent that to happen, but this will log all those activities. So the first rule is we are saying that S3 bucket should not allow public write. Okay, so we are creating AWS config rule with the name. Source is owner is AWS, and source identifier is S3 bucket public write prohibited. Okay, so if you can just go over there, config rule. Okay, AWS config rule, and then there are multiple examples given to you. Okay, first is bucket versioning enabled, and then there are multiple things over here. And so these rules are predefined rule. You can also create custom rules. I believe, yeah, you can create custom policies, but we are using the predefined rules. Okay, so let me show you from where you can get the values of those rules. I guess this is the source. So we have valid values are AWS custom lambda or custom policy, right? So AWS owner AWS, meaning this is created by AWS. These are some of the predefined rules that you are using. Custom lambda and custom policy, you are creating it, you are customizing it. These are the managed rules. So if you open this, I believe this will show you all the available options, list of managed rules. Yeah, so these are all the managed rules. So we are using from these rules. So for example, let's say if we search for here, S3 bucket, maybe S3, no, not this one. Hmm, let's check from where did I get it. These are managed rules, so not this one. Wait, I think predefined identifier, from where we get this predefined identifier, it was source identifier, right? So source over here, source details. I don't remember from where did I get these values, but I believe it will be from some of the documentation. It's not here. Side list of managed rules. It's not here. What was the name? S3. Okay, I think the name is different. For example, if I select this, yeah, so the identifier, okay, okay, I got it now. So if I search S3 hyphen bucket, public write prohibited, public access prohibited, and public write prohibited. Okay, so this is over here, and inside that there'll be an identifier in capital letters, and instead of hyphen there'll be underscore. Okay, so this is what we have used over here, is the source identifier. Okay, so this source identifier will ensure that public write will be prohibited, and there are, as you can see, hundreds and hundreds of these identifiers that you can use from. The next is ensure S3 bucket have encryption enabled. Again, for that we have this identifier, server side encryption enabled. Then we are ensuring that S3 bucket block public access. So we are using S3 bucket public read prohibited. So we are blocking public read and write both. Now The next config rule is ensure EBS volumes are encrypted. So it will check that with the encrypted volume identifier. It will check if it has required tags or not. Now with required tags, we have to provide the input parameter, what tag it should look for, right? So we need to provide tag 1 key value, tag 2 key value, right? So resources should have these two tags. That's what we are saying. And scope is instance and S3 bucket. So these two resources should be in the scope. Okay. And then we are also ensuring root account has MFA enabled. So owner again AWS, root account and MFA enabled, and so on, right? So these are all the main resources that we are creating. And yeah, in variable, I guess we only have AWS region and project name. That's it. So let's go ahead and let's execute the TF commands. So TF init, all right, and TF plan. So let's check all the resources. Okay, it says 23 resources to be created. Let's apply TF apply hyphen hyphen auto approve. Okay, I'm just gonna pause the recording while it's doing its work. Okay, so it has been completed. All the resource has been applied. Now let's go and verify and then we can test as well. So I'm gonna go to my AWS console and no, not root user. Okay, so let's go ahead and check the S3 bucket first. So we created three type of resources. So S3 bucket for the config. So the name should be over here. Okay, Terraform governance demo config bucket, and at the end there is a random string, and that it has a folder of AWS logs with the config rules and everything, right? So now let's go back over here and let's check the properties. If you check the properties, it will show you bucket versioning is enabled. Okay, and it has tags that we have created, and the default encryption is server-side encryption with S3 managed keys, and it should be bucket keys disabled because we used AES encryption. And yeah, I believe these were the all the things that we did for the S3 bucket. Now let's check the next resource, which is IAM policy. Okay, and policies over here, let's filter it from customer managed. So these are the policies that we have created. So these three policies, MFA delete policy, if the user does not have MFA enable, it should not be able to delete any resource, and it has been applied. Then we have demo required tags, S3 encryption in transit, right? And then we have finally we created the config rule. So AWS config, inside AWS config will be having rules, and it will also show you the compliance dashboard. So if you go over here, and it will show you how many resources are compliant and how many resources are non-compliant. For example, it is showing that required tag, so there is one required tag that it should have that particular tag, right? So it is showing that one resource is not compliant. So if we want to go and check that resource, what that resource is, that is the S3 bucket. So there is this demo bucket that we have created. It's non-compliant because it does not have that particular tag that it should have. Okay, so that's one. And the four compliant rules are like the rest of the rules. My root account has MFA enabled. That is why it is showing as compliant. S3 bucket that we have created has public read and write prohibited. And server side encryption is enabled for that. So all of these are compliant. Now let's try to force an uncompliant resource. Okay. So over here with the AWS CLI, I'm going to create a new bucket object. So AWS, I'm going to create a new bucket. So AWS S3 mb, so this is the cli command for that, and then s3 colon colon name of the bucket, so let's say test validation, and let's add a random string. So I'm just gonna add the date plus percentage s to it. Okay, so now what are we doing? We are creating a bucket without the server side encryption. We have not provided the details for server side encryption, right? Okay, it says the bucket has been created. Now we need to wait for a few minutes before the violation is detected. Currently, if we go over here in the dashboard, it is not showing that resource that we have created, right? So I'm just gonna pause the recording for a few minutes and then we'll see. Okay, so I've waited for like 2 minutes probably, and now I can see two non-compliant resources. So if you click on that, it says the bucket that we have just created is non-compliant, and if we click on that, it says why it is not uncompliant. Let's go ahead and check. It says the resource name is this, view configuration item. Over here it says let's see. Okay, required tags. Okay, sorry, the server side encryption is enabled by default and it is showing over here as well. Even with the CLI command, it is enabled, so that is why it is not throwing the compliant error for this thing, but it did not have the required tags, and that is why it is showing non-compliant. It ran the config rules against the resource for all the rules, right? It checked for all the available rules for S3 related rules, and it found that three were compliant and one was non-compliant, and that is why it has thrown the error for. Now, let's do one more thing. Let's check for one more config. Okay. Blah. So we have root account MFA enabled, S3 bucket, read prohibited, server side encryption enabled, encrypted volume. There is no volume currently. Actually, not with the config, because we have already seen. Let's check with the IAM policy. So we have this IAM policy over here, and what are the policies that we have? Let's filter it by customer managed, and we have MFA delete. So this user that I have logged in with, it doesn't have MFA enabled. So if I try to delete anything from this, and what all resources are in scope for this, I believe S3 bucket only. So I should be denied S3 delete access, right? So let's go back on S3 bucket, and let's try to delete the bucket that I have just created, which is this one. Okay, and first we need to empty the bucket. So let's permanently delete all the objects inside the bucket. Okay, it deleted the object. Now let's go back over here and let's delete. Provide the bucket name over here. Okay, now it says deleted the bucket. So why did it let me delete the bucket? Now I want you to let me know in the comments below why it let me delete the bucket when I have an IAM policy created already for this. I had the IAM policy I have shown you, I have created with you, which explicitly says if the MFA is not enabled for any particular user, that access should be denied. And if you can check, this is my IAM user from which I have logged in, which is DevOps A user, and this user, click on the user, and let's see, it's you see, enabled without MFA. MFA is not enabled for this user, so this should have been restricted. It shouldn't have allowed me to delete the bucket, but still it did. Why did it happen? Now let me know in the comment section, and let's see if you have understood it or not. Okay, so you can verify it from there as well. The policy attached, not this one, here, right? delete object. It says S3 delete object is the action, multi-factor authentication present should be false, and the action is deny. But then why did it let me delete the object? Okay. Okay, that's it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it valuable, and make sure to delete the resources before closing this session. I will see you tomorrow with the next video, which will be day 22 video. This was day 21, and we'll be doing more real-time projects. We'll be doing more hands-on and more interesting stuff. So that's it. Happy learning. Keep sharing, keep commenting, keep giving the support, and keep learning. Have a good day, have a good night, and I will see you tomorrow.